Fallout 3 transported players to the retro-futuristic wasteland of Washington, D.C., where players were granted unparalleled freedom to forge their own path, from scavenging for survival to shaping the fate of entire communities, and every moral dilemma in between. But what many don't know is the controversial story of Fallout 3's development. Many believe that Bethesda, led by Todd Howard, was the brainchild of the Fallout universe. However, the origins of this post-apocalyptic masterpiece trace back to the efforts of the trio Tim Kaine, Jason Anderson, and Leonard Boyarsky of Interplay Games back in 1997. But Interplay would shut down 5 years later, and the rights of Fallout were auctioned off to the highest bidder, which Todd Howard of Bethesda desperately wanted. Getting his wish granted, Howard and Bethesda were driven to take Fallout 3 to new heights. This is a tale of ambition, living up to expectations, and the enduring legacy of a game that captivated millions. This is the story of Fallout 3. Fallout was conceptualized in empty conference rooms of Interplay Entertainment during off hours in 1994, with trio Tim Kaine, Jason Anderson, and Leonard Boyarsky leading the development. The three had unlimited time to perfect their creation, as the rest of the studio were busy working on a brand new Dungeons & Dragons game. Filling out the team during the years, Fallout 1 released in 1997 and garnered critical acclaim and was viewed as one of the best RPGs ever made. Because of the success of Fallout and owning the D&D license, Interplay created a brand new internal developer, Black Isle Studios. This team was headed by Fergus Urquhart and was essentially the Fallout team, with the studio looking to set the gears in motion for a sequel. Within a few months though of development on Fallout 2, Kaine, Anderson, and Boyarsky would leave Interplay, with Kaine citing being overworked on Fallout 1 with a whole year of crunch, and because of this he didn't intend on making a sequel, opting to take a break. But instead he ended up being forced into the team lead on Fallout 2, with Interplay wanting it out in a year. I was super exhausted, I was physically exhausted, I was mentally exhausted. My soul was empty from literally almost a year of crunch on Fallout 1. Then I was told that Fallout 2 had to be out by the following October in '98, meaning we're looking at a year of crunch, a whole game in less than a year. I don't know if I could do that. He also began to be undermined on the project, with one incident in particular pushing him to his limits. A random marketer told him that he would not be able to use his team's box art, which they did for the previous one, and instead use an external company. He was never asked his opinion nor told he could be part of these creative decisions in the future. The last straw for Kaine at Interplay came when Brian Fargo, Interplay's founder, cut his bonus check. The reason was that there was a critical bug on the original Fallout that hindered the release date by a few weeks, and Kaine never told him who was responsible. The big reason was he said, "You didn't tell me whose bug it was, and you said you wanted responsibility for it, so take it." I just looked at him and I was like, is this supposed to encourage me in any way to work on Fallout 2? He goes, yeah, it'll encourage you to do better next time. I went home and I drafted my resignation. I sat on it for about 2 weeks. Came in one morning, told Leonard and Jason I'm quitting. I go back to my office. I've been away from my office now for about 2 hours. I go back. Leonard and Jason took my letter, copied it, and resigned as well. After their leave from Interplay, the three would go on to create their own studio, Troika Games. But despite their leave and Interplay's bad financial situation, Black Isle still released Fallout 2 a year later and garnered a cult following for the Fallout franchise. This is where things started to turn bad for Interplay, who are now going through a buyout with Titus Interactive, and would force the studio away from PC development to focus on simple console games. Black Isle did attempt to create a Fallout 3 in 1999, but failed to switch from 2D to 3D using the new graphics engine NDL, which led Urquhart to change focus on creating the successful Icewind Dale instead in 2000. But Interplay still wanted a Fallout 3, and even though they didn't have the resources yet, they told a certain designer, Chris Avalon, that sometime soon they would. Avalon had began working at Interplay in 1996, working on projects such as Descent to Under a Mountain, Conquest of the New World, and Star Trek Starfleet Academy. He got his big break for Interplay when he was asked to be the lead designer for what would become Black Isle Studios' Planescape Torment. He simultaneously worked on Torment and Fallout 2, as when Tim Kaine left, Interplay pulled anyone they could for Fallout 2 to help. Avalon became an area designer, designing such areas as New Reno and Vault City, with New Reno becoming renowned for being one of the greatest RPG creations of all time, and showcasing Avalon's ability. Fallout presented me with a series of ways of interacting with characters through conversations and quests that I hadn't seen before in RPGs. The amount of reactivity you got based on your character build was really intriguing to me. That really influenced what I did with dialogue in Planescape. So now with New Reno, I wanted players to be able to go there and do anything they wanted to do. But between working on Fallout 2 and Planescape for 3 years, Avalon's health quickly declined. I'd put on so much weight, the doctor had told me not to continue down this road, and I really needed to get my life in order. so Avalon slowly had his workload decreased, and would contribute on Icewind Dale in the meantime. And by contributing, Avalon wrote the dialogue of all the major NPCs, and also edited those written by the other designers. Shortly after Icewind Dale was finishing is when Avalon began working on what would become Fallout Van Buren. Avalon was the only person working on Van Buren, and without a team, he needed to figure out how to prototype an entire game by himself. Luckily for him, he was an RPG enthusiast, and prototyped the game the only way he knew how, a pen and paper version. Avalon created rough drafts of the initial system mechanics, area design, character breakdowns, items, and plot elements for all locations in the game. Avalon's story for Fallout 3 would feature an antagonist leading a rival party who the player would then run into throughout the game. He tested this mechanic using 2 teams of developers at Interplay, who, unbeknownst to them, were giving Avalon valuable feedback on this approach, as the 2 games would reference each other. I thought this would be a more interesting series of adversaries, instead of a Foozle villain. You have a group that's a lot like your band. They're not evil, just have a different approach, and try to push the theme of the prisoner's dilemma, which is a theorem that cooperating with an opponent yields a greater reward than trying to beat them, to explore even new ways of solving situations in role-playing games. While Fallout didn't necessarily use typical RPG classes, he noticed his co-workers still attempted situations in 3 ways: combat, stealth, and speech. With speech being an area of RPGs Avalon didn't really enjoy. He saw the speech skill as something of an instant win for players, a choice that they just make because it allows for the most optimum results in that conversation. To change this for Van Buren, Avalon was going to create a much more in-depth system, where players would learn more about who they were talking to the longer they spoke to them, which would give players dialogue options to manipulate them in certain ways. It may not be a bad thing to make someone hostile because you know, based on speaking with this person, what they're going to do when they get mad. That might be to your advantage, so seeing the red hostile response may not be a bad thing, and a speech character may want to guide a character towards that and provoke a certain result. On top of the 3 usual playstyles seen in Fallout and RPGs in general, Avalon was going to add a unique playstyle to Van Buren that was inspired by a book called Lucifer's Hammer, where a character takes advantage of advanced scientific knowledge that had been preserved from a time before the apocalypse. Avalon thought it would be a great idea to see how a player would play the game with a scientist who is equipped with pre-nuclear war knowledge and resources, potentially thriving in the wasteland. The game was going to be set in the American Southwest, with the antagonist of the game being a scientist named Presper, who, with his colleagues, froze themselves in a cold sleep stasis before the nuke dropped. Avalon's first outline for Fallout 3 had Presper monitoring the player's actions and choices throughout the game, and would then decide whether or not to cleanse the entire world of human life before waking his fellow scientists based on your decisions. The player would be known as the prisoner, who would be escaping prison right in the beginning of the game. Players could choose whether their character was rightly convicted or not. If you chose to be a criminal, you could select which crime you had committed, which would impact your starting stats. Interestingly, Avalon had 3 starting races players could choose from: human, a ghoul, or a super mutant. Each of them had their own communities and specific quests over the course of the game, their own special traits, perks, and limitations they could choose. The fact that you could play something beyond a human was definitely one of the goals of the game. Avalon was also going to greatly change what the Pip-Boy could do in Van Buren. Players would be able to monitor other Pip-Boys worn by other prisoners who escaped with you, which meant players could read their quest log to see where they were and what they were doing. On top of that, the Pip-Boy could be modded with add-ons that would allow players certain perks throughout the game. Like if you're trapped in a building and a fire broke out, your Pip-Boy would suddenly wake up, let you know where all the fire exits were, and where the sprinkler system was. And then suddenly you could use that functionality in any building you went into. So the more you explored and the more you got exposed to certain situations, the more your interface would grow and expand. We sort of wanted the interface to feel like another dungeon you were exploring over the course of the game. This was the first stage of the Van Buren development, and this is where Chris Avellone would leave Interplay in 2003, following the leave of Fergus Urquhart. These 2 and a few other devs would go on to create their own studio, Obsidian Entertainment. But Van Buren would see a few more months of development before the impoverished Interplay would be caught in numerous legal battles after Titus's acquisition, which saw them lose the D&D license and $20 million. Interplay canceled their Baldur's Gate 3 project and shut down Black Isle Studio, ending Van Buren. The project was whispered to have an engine that was 95% done, with 75% of the dialogue done and 50% of the map completed. Soon after, Titus sought to close Interplay and sell its assets off, something that Boyarsky knew would happen before he left. Interplay had been a great place to work, and we felt that it was losing a lot of what we felt was great about it, and that they were making a lot of bad decisions that would destroy the company. We were about 5 or 6 years early on that. but we saw the writing on the wall. The biggest asset that Titus could auction off was of course the Fallout IP. There were many studios eyeing it. Troika, consisting of Kane, Boyarsky, and Anderson, were of course one of them, as they wanted to work on their baby again. But what they were unaware of was that there was one man who wanted Fallout more than anybody else, Todd Howard of Bethesda. During Oblivion's early development, Bethesda had made a list of settings that they would like to attempt after, and post-apocalyptic was at the very top. This led to the beginning creation of a game called Apocalypse Road that would be inspired by Fallout, but Todd had always wanted the real thing, even when Interplay still owned it. A bunch of the people who run the company knew the people at Interplay. We pestered and pestered. Like, are you guys using Fallout? They weren't doing anything with it. Can we do something? This pestering over the years paid off for Howard, when unknowingly to him, would finally get his chance at creating a Fallout game, when his VP of development left a sticky note on his keyboard saying, "Fallout's yours." Bethesda announced to the world in 2004 that they would be the ones working on the brand new Fallout 3. As president of Bethesda, Vlatko Antonov said, "Fallout is one of the great RPG franchises. Bethesda's proven expertise in this genre, building on our experience and the tremendous success we have enjoyed with our cutting-edge Elder Scrolls series, will enable us to create the next chapter of Fallout that is worthy of the franchise." But while this announcement came in 2004, the real work for Fallout 3 didn't start until after Oblivion was finished in 2006. Todd Howard's goal for Fallout 3 was to bring the franchise back to RPG prominence and do the series justice, all while bringing it to the current day. But before they could do this, Bethesda needed to do their research. The biggest inspiration that they looked at was obviously Fallout 1, as lead producer Gavin Carter told Eurogamer. "We went back and played the old games, to see what we wanted to bring over from those games, and to get our minds away from the medieval space of the Elder Scrolls. The first Fallout told Bethesda everything they needed to know about how the characters, dialogue, and humor should be for a Fallout game. The tone and that Americana vibe are all in the first Fallout, so when you're building a sequel to something as beloved and as good as the original, you don't need lots of other sources." Another big source of inspiration came from reading and watching many post-nuclear, post-apocalyptic movies and books, like Mad Max or The Road. While this gave Bethesda a look into the horrors of a destroyed world, Todd Howard wanted to get a deeper look into how people reacted to the original games. What I like to do is read old reviews, because they're written in a way that doesn't have a lot of aging. They talk about how great the animation looks, and how crazy it is when you kill people, and if you were just to pop the game in and play it, those things wouldn't register with you. On top of all this, Interplay actually sent over the hard drive containing all the old designs. They sent us everything, so we got to poke through that and see all the old design stuff that didn't make it and what made it. While Bethesda had all the inspiration in the world at their disposal, the one thing they didn't have was the help of the original developers. And while this bothered fans of the franchise, Bethesda was not worried about it at all. Picking up where somebody else left off is always daunting. Taking somebody else's work that you respect and then doing what you feel is right by them is not easy. More than anything, we want those guys to know that we're taking care of what they started. We can't continue to walk around on eggshells and worry if it's going to be okay for us to do this or that. We're great believers of reinvention in everything we do. And Gavin Carter was a bit more straightforward about this subject. Fallout 1 and Fallout 2 had many different people working on them. We have a great deal of respect for those guys. But what we don't want to do is open up our entire design to someone outside the company who doesn't really get the culture here. We're very strict on authorial control. We don't want to bring someone in from the outside and then only implement their ideas in a superficial way. We have a vision for the game and we're taking it all the way through. Their vision for Fallout 3 was a much darker version that players had previously seen in the original titles, with Pete Hines describing it as a world being really messed up and things wouldn't be going well for the survivors. Humanity still exists, but it's scraping out in existence, so it's a bit of a harsher take than what we've seen in previous Fallout games. That's not to say that's all it is about, but I think we honed in on that as being important to us, to really capture the harshness of the world and the struggle to survive. Creating the wasteland itself was a real struggle for the team, who were doing preliminary work on the atmosphere and landscape, 3 years before Oblivion was finished. The switch to a destroyed world from a fantasy setting took a lot of work for Bethesda, as Pete Hines told The Guardian. Regarding visuals, it's much easier to do a beautiful setting with rivers and waterfalls and trees, but there is a real beauty in the destruction of things. You come over a hill and in front of you is what used to be a highway, and someone has set up a settlement under the bridge for protection. It's really interesting to see how people have tried to live on in this world. We tried to vary what you find, but also give you those epic vistas. This was especially true for lead artist Istvan Peli, who was known to be a perfectionist, which saw him having to deal with a lot more minute details with the 1950s wasteland. You're very much immersed in this 1950s future retro tech world, And that sets this tone of what was the world like before it went to hell. Istvan is a stickler for detail and everything has to be perfect. Every button, every knob, and every switch has to have a purpose. There has to be a rhyme and a reason for everything in the game, so when the player interacts with something, it feels natural. While the Wasteland was an unsettling dark place, Bethesda were sure to add the humor Fallout was known for, specifically the first Fallout. We knew we wanted to emulate the darker, more serious tone of the original Fallout as closely as we could. That's not to say we didn't want the game to be humorous, we did. But for us, the Fallout humor is much darker. It's finding the funny in the insane. It's laughing because if you don't, you'll cry. Pete Hines specifically mentions the juxtaposition of the positive view of the pre-nuclear war life to the reality after, as a huge inspiration for their humor as well. Like you're in an elementary school with posters that say duck and cover under your desk when the bomb falls. So clearly that didn't work. Seeing the idealistic optimism pre-war view with the bombed out reality is really powerful. While some of these jokes would be obvious, Bethesda focused on creating a lot more subtle humor throughout Fallout 3 as well. The underlying tone of humor in the artwork is more subtle, but there are little things that, for example, we were trying to come up with. What sort of object and clutter are we going to use in our urban landscape? And our concept artist Adam Adamowicz came up with a coin-operated Fallout shelter. This is a little steel tube that you put 50 cents in, and you close yourself in. You're in a one little person Fallout shelter in case the bombs happen to drop when you're out shopping. And it's a ridiculous idea, but it's systematically very appropriate for the culture of the time period that we were trying to achieve. The original Van Buren Fallout 3 was going to be set in the American Southwest, but Bethesda ended up on the idea of creating the game in a city that they knew very well, and wasn't a popular location for video games at all, Washington, D.C. I was thinking of setting it on the West Coast, and Emil really pushed, we should do it out here, and I was like, I don't know if that's the right Fallout feel, you know? But the more we thought about it, I was like, oh yeah, we got it. Who can blow up Washington, D.C. better than us? Since Bethesda's office was down the street from the Capitol, it was very easy for them to get the references they needed, as team members would drive over and begin taking pictures of everything there, especially concept artist Adam Adamowicz. You walk down that street and there's a lot of material for you to play with while looking at a lot of the buildings. I would walk in Adams Morgan and I'd see a cluster of houses and say, wow, that's amazing, all right. We put a lot of chrome flanges on them, but just the configuration of things would give you ideas, and one would bounce off the other, so it was a continuous process. They would also travel to the abandoned torn down buildings in DC to get a sense of the first-hand destruction and how ruined buildings could be constructed in the game. But being in Washington, DC and taking pictures of everything did lead the team into some funny situations, especially when it's around the White House. I spent a lot of time on weekends going through DC with a digital camera, and when you're going around the White House taking pictures of manhole covers, people want to know why. And my answer would be very simple. I'm just imagining what this would all look like if it was blown up. One of the reasons Bethesda was so excited about using DC was the amount of landmarks they could use for the game. There's just a lot of great symbolism in DC in a post-nuclear landscape. There's lots of great architecture that we all know and love from the area, so it's just a natural fit. Bethesda included locations such as the Lincoln Memorial, National Archives, the National Mall, and the Jefferson Memorial. The White House was going to be included in the game, but Bethesda was working on everything else around it that they ran out of time to implement it, so their idea was to have it destroyed, as that would have been one of the first targets for a nuke anyway. It was a sort of Indiana Jones shoot your gun at the whip guy kind of moment. Besides adding the obvious landmarks from DC, Bethesda took the liberty to create some of their own original cities and sites as well. Places like the Republic of Dave, Agatha's House, Andale, and Megaton City, where settlers live around an unexploded atomic bomb. There were other unique locations Bethesda included in Fallout 3, the vaults. While the original Fallout each only mentioned a single vault, Bethesda decided to include 6 vaults that players could discover on their journey. Now it's unclear whether Bethesda were planning to continue Tim Kane's idea of the Enclave using the vaults for deranged experiments for their multi-generational starship plan. But Bethesda nevertheless created some of the most disturbing vaults for Fallout 3, like Vault 108 where players happen to come across many violent clones named Gary, or Vault 92, where musicians were exposed to white noise experiments, turning them violently insane. Wanting a bigger emphasis on vault life, Bethesda created the main protagonist as a vault dweller from Vault 101. I've always been interested in games that just start and you play them. The character generation is part of the game. An earlier influence is Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. When it came to writer Emil Pagliarulo though, he wanted to create a story that was focused on character development, asking the question, how does the character change throughout the game? His answer for this was the idea of the father, That was certainly one of the ultimate goals, to get the player invested in the relationship with the dad character from the very beginning. I figured the best way for that to happen was for you to actually start the game from the period of your birth, and to see your father at every step of the way. Bethesda was able to secure the talents of Liam Neeson to voice the father, and as Gavin Carter told Eurogamer, who wouldn't want Liam Neeson as their dad, right? Emil, Todd, and Pete came up with this idea at the time when they themselves had just become fathers, and wanted to explore this dynamic in a game. By sheer coincidence, Cormac McCarthy released his novel The Road, which explores the story of a father escorting his son through a post-apocalyptic America, which strengthened their belief that this was the right direction for Fallout 3. The central goal to the plot was for the players to find out why and how their father mysteriously left the vault. This mystery leads to one of the greatest moments in Fallout 3, walking out of the vault and seeing the Capital Wasteland slowly come into focus for the first time, in modern first-person graphics. While the main plot involves finding your father, the bigger issue in Fallout 3 was creating clean water. Emil was inspired to turn the Jefferson Memorial into a giant water purifier, thus creating Project Purity. The water idea wasn't completely out of nowhere, as Fallout 1's main story centered around a water chip. It certainly plays off the original games where water was a big focal point, a theme. We've continued on that legacy. Water is a big, important resource in this world. War Never Changes was also a central theme with Project Purity, and obviously Fallout 3 as an entirety, as Emil explained to Vagrant Bard. Human beings still haven't really stopped trying to kill each other, hence the war never changes. So why is that important? Well, I think it makes you realize just how precious the little things in life really are. In the game, when you think about it, what are you ultimately trying to accomplish? You're not slaying an ancient evil or destroying an alien civilization. You're trying to give fresh water to a few hundred people. Life is so depressing. Fresh water is the best they can hope for. Something simple, something we in real life take for granted every day, seems monumental in a world that is completely ravaged by war. I don't know about you, but that certainly helps put things in perspective for me. Around this time, Bethesda knew what they were becoming known for: huge open-world RPGs that players love to explore. With their latest title Oblivion being fresh in their minds, Bethesda were able to take the lessons they learned from it and immediately implement them into Fallout 3. One of the big problems Bethesda ran into with Oblivion was they didn't accurately anticipate what they thought players were going to do in the world. In Oblivion, the most extreme example is the bandits, whose armor keeps going up and up as you're playing through the game. Suddenly, they've got glass armor and amazing weapons. It was an obvious thing that didn't feel right, so we spent a lot of time on making sure that the players have the ability to go where they want and to do what they want, but to also provide them with situations where they're going to get in over their head, or they're getting into situations where they're further through the game and their character is really tough. Another change Bethesda did for Fallout 3 was the ability of killing quest NPCs. Because in Oblivion, there were many NPCs that were flagged as unkillable, as Bethesda didn't want players to break the quest. This was changed in Fallout 3 with the devs looking at making sure the quest could be continued even if a character died. This ensured players could still continue their game without fundamentally breaking it, allowing them to kill off almost every character that isn't labeled as essential for the main story. One of the biggest lessons Bethesda learned from Oblivion came from the Radiant AI technology. Bethesda recognized how to improve this AI more so after Oblivion was released, which would give them more lifelike AI for Fallout 3. We now have more activities that NPCs can engage in, and things like sandbox packages, where we can instruct an NPC to interact with anything they find in a particular area, instead of standing around dumbly. It adds up to better NPC behavior and more lively atmosphere in the game. Bethesda also attempted to fix their stiff AI models that many players disliked from Oblivion, as Gavin Carter explained to Game Banshee. While Oblivion was 100% hand animated, we've been working on Fallout to mix in more motion captured animations for more natural motion. For faces, we've managed to find ways to make the system more efficient, enabling us to give people more polys and higher texture resolution on their faces. We've also created an entirely separate base head for females, so that we can build in more feminine features from the start. Bethesda also redid the code for the pathfinding system for their AI, which would hopefully eliminate the majority of the NPCs acting stupid in the world. But a big chunk of time for Bethesda went into honing the combat for Fallout 3's AI, as most of it was new to them, as the AI this time had guns, so they would actively try and find cover and angles of fire. Bethesda made sure that Fallout 3 would be non-linear and open-ended, just like the originals. Players could explore every single nook and cranny of the Capital Wasteland, something that took the team a very long time to figure out, as Gavin Carter explained. We spent a lot of time talking about what if the player doesn't want to go where we want them? What if they stumble on the spot that we wanted for in-game? We have to handle that. A lot of our time has been spent planning for every single contingency that could possibly happen. Bethesda did this because they didn't enjoy how some games corner players into a certain direction, not really giving them the freedom they initially thought they had. The team ensured that players in the Wasteland could go wherever, whenever they wanted. It's more like making the player feel like they have their own path, as opposed to, I'm this level, it looks like there are a lot of ways to go, but it turns out that every alley I go down is a dead end. Every door I try is locked, and there's only really one way I can go. That feels a lot more heavily scripted and constraining. And that's what we try and avoid. You can do whatever you want. We might have told you to go somewhere, but if you don't want to be doing this, you can go off and do something else. We try to focus more on that. Even with this freedom, Bethesda made sure that there was always an objective that pointed players back to the main quest and their Pip-Boys, to ensure players could go back to the main quest without being completely lost in the Wasteland. Besides just being a map for the players, Bethesda put in extra work to make sure the Pip-Boy would be a robust interface for players, showing them their stat conditions, player skills, perks, and special information, as Emil explained to IGN. It's this device you have that's helping you manage your life. It feels like you leave the vault and the only thing you take with you is this piece of technology strapped to your wrist. It becomes your sort of lifeline. Bethesda also made sure that the Pip-Boy looked and felt realistic, to add to the immersion and atmosphere, but also kept it humorous to fit into the Fallout world completely. You're looking at a stat and it can be very dry if you just lay them out. This is what strength does, this is what intelligence does, and there's this perk called Animal Fiend, and it will make animals not attack you. But when you pull it up in the game, that's when your Pip-Boy flips up. It's this retro device and it says Animal Friend, and it has a stupid picture of a Vault Boy with like this giant rabbit. And like, it's funny, and so it makes the act of looking at your character's stats another thing that players do all the time, and you make those things entertaining. We spent forever on the Pip-Boy. While the game clearly had a main quest, a huge part of work was put into the side quest, and other various situations players could find themselves in while exploring. Something that Bethesda knew gamers loved about their vast worlds. Bethesda ensured that these side quests introduced players to unique, captivating characters and scenarios, to increase player attachment to the world and the game's overall replayability, as some of these quests had multiple outcomes, as Todd Howard explained. Yes, we tried to implement choice as much as possible. Virtually all quests in the game have some branching aspect to them, and you can and will lock off certain quests and their rewards depending on the choices you make. Like the 10-penny tower quest, for example, which asks players to side with the rich to exterminate ghouls who just want a place to live, or players can instead help the ghouls end the human lives of the tower. Bethesda made sure that players could complete these quests in any fashion they wanted. In regards to using different skills, most definitely. We're really pushing on that, and I think that's the crux of the game. What skills you use, so each quest or goal of the players can be accomplished in different ways, using different skills. This also went for players who thoroughly enjoy stealth as a main way of playing games. Even if Bethesda thought it wasn't as exciting as running in guns blazing, the important part Bethesda knew they needed to get right was the payoff of stealth gameplay, and to make sure that stealth itself didn't feel bogged down. They had to make sure a player playing a stealth build would allow the player to play that way and feel like they had the option in the first place, instead of it just being a sneak around everyone gimmick. As Pete Hines told IGN, "I don't know about exciting. If you're trying to avoid combat or sneak past stuff, it's tough to make that as fun or as visceral as running around blowing something's head off. But at the same time, if you're rewarding the player with something that's really unique and different, that you're never going to see if you don't play that way, then that's the big thing. If you played it that way, you get to see a robot melt a couple of super mutants' heads off, and there's some hilarious dialogue there, and you get to see something that you never would have seen otherwise." Most of these side quests would offer a player a dilemma to solve, which would usually be a good or evil way to complete them. And then there's this whole good and evil aspect. This is based on how you deal with people in the game. Definitely go talk to Gob, the bartender in Megaton. If you take his feelings into account, you get a different experience and he will talk to you differently. The conversations in Fallout 3 were something Todd Howard was really proud of. The dialogue trees were much larger and more in-depth than the originals, and were all tree-based and not topic-based like Oblivion. To keep the game like an RPG, Bethesda included speech challenges as well. These are when players could use their speech skill when talking to NPCs to try and get something out at a percentage chance it will succeed or not. Asking for something small would be much easier to pull off than asking for something big, and if the player's speech skill fails, that NPC would like the player less. The player could also open up more dialogue options based on their speech skill rating and who they were talking to. While players could potentially talk their way out of issues, most of the time Fallout 3's quests involved wiping someone or something off the wasteland, and how players resolve these conflicts generally plays a big part in affecting their karma. One of, if not the biggest dilemmas players would be confronted with in the wasteland came from the Power of the Atom quest, which questions the player's morality of arming the Nuke in Megaton City, either wiping this settlement from the capital wasteland or letting them live. Bethesda was intent on giving players these moral decisions and telling compelling stories in Fallout, as Emil told Gaming Nexus. For Fallout 3, we really just wanted to tell some interesting stories and give the player a chance to make real choices. So there are fewer quests than there were in Oblivion, but they're much richer, much deeper. Most have multiple paths and solutions, and because it's Fallout, even the simplest task might seem like a clear-cut fetch quest on the surface, but then reveal itself to be something much deeper. And these quests were all across the wasteland, just waiting for players to stumble across them to test their morals. To calculate a player's morality within the wasteland, Bethesda added a karma system that would score players based on their decisions within the game. At a basic level, it is a value that we use to track the sum total of your good and evil actions in the game. It's a way to communicate to the players which side of the line they fall on, and to what extent. Certain characters will have different reactions to the player based on his or her karma. This was a huge pillar Bethesda knew they needed to have in Fallout. It was one of the key tenets of Fallout that we needed to do. Right at the top was choice and consequences in every questline, as much as we possibly can. Every little bit from what equipment you pick up, to whether you're going to shoot this guy in the head, is going to have that choice. And there are going to be consequences. The players were not the only ones who were given choices when it came to these quests. For Fallout, Bethesda attempted something they never tried with Oblivion, having a lead writer, who would then branch the storytelling to the designers to finish on their own. Emil, the lead writer, laid out the main quest, side quest, and the characters, creating the framework for the whole game, which would then be filled with details by the designers. We had the story written and we had the outlines for all the quests, but then we have a lot of talented designers here. We wanted to pass that stuff on to them, so they would be given the rough outlines of these miscellaneous quests, and then they would have the freedom to flesh those out themselves. There was one rule though that Bethesda followed when it came to writing the quest, not to try to be the original writers. We tried to stay away from trying to emulate anyone specifically. Chris Avalon, fantastic writer. Those are huge shoes to fill. You can't think about that too much, you'll become paralyzed. With so many quests and consequences, the obvious morality choices were good and evil, as Bethesda looked at previous games with morality systems like KOTOR and Fable for inspiration. But as Bethesda kept playtesting, they realized that the quests were becoming more and more complex, and that some of the outcomes might be in a gray area, leading them to create a neutral playstyle. As we got deeper into development and the quests started to get more complex and take on varying shades of gray, we realized, that the black and white nature of the karma system wasn't really working for us. So we started thinking more and more about this nebulous neutral area that really no other game had featured before. Before long, we found we had embraced it as a core element of the game, but that of course led to a lot of internal discussions, even disagreements, about how to track this type of behavior in the game. In the end, I think we struck a really good balance between all those elements, and you really can play the game as good, evil, or something in between. The karma system was designed to only keep track of the history of players' choices and signal a certain playstyle. It did not inherently change the game itself, as Pete Hines explained to IGN. It's not so much about people not talking to you because you're a bad guy with bad karma, as much as it is about using the karma to keep track and keep score on the kind of character you're playing. We want the reward and the payoff to be more in the choices you make and have it be more immediate. The most drastic change Bethesda did for Fallout 3 was making the game a first-person shooter, as they wanted to return to creating a shooting game after so many titles with swords and sorcery. It's really what excites us in terms of what's going to have the biggest impact to you when you're playing the game. So that's the main reason for first person, is that I want you to touch the world and make it feel real, and I just think the emotional impact of that is much greater. The game would include over 60 weapons for players to find or create. The crafted items were some of the most interesting that Bethesda included in the game. Things like the railway rifle, which used old metal piping and a pressure cooker that fired railroad spikes at enemies, or the Deathclaw gauntlet that players could strap to their hands. But if players were willing to explore, they could find even more dangerous weapons like the Lincoln repeater rifle or the alien blaster that lies within an unmarked part of the wasteland. Bethesda made sure to spend as much time as possible ensuring that the gun combat was going to be as perfect as possible, as Pete Hines told IGN. We certainly spent a lot of time on that because we felt that the shooter element, what you're doing minute to minute, has to look good and feel fun. If that's all you do for 10 minutes, it has to feel good, because 99% of people at some point are going to pick up a gun and start shooting stuff. And if it doesn't feel right and doesn't look right, then we have a big problem. Balancing everything about the weapons such as speed, ammo, reload animations was something the team could only fix after playtesting the game over and over. But the real challenge for them was balancing the stats within the game that affected how good players became with weapons, something that the team had to go over hundreds and hundreds of times. But the mix of first-person shooting and role-playing created a problem with the speed of the game, and created something that felt like an old RPG system, in a game that was intended to be created for the masses. They knew some players aren't going to be good at the action stuff, or that some players would want a slower combat option to really get into the role-playing experience of their character. But at the same time, Bethesda wanted to create a never-before-seen system within the game that showed off players' characters doing awesome stuff in a cinematic style. We wanted the ability for you to see your character doing really cool things that you couldn't necessarily do. But we're conscientious that some players aren't going to be really good at the heavy action stuff. So we try to walk that line. We felt that we knew we wanted to have you stop the game in some way. In the beginning, we didn't know how. But Bethesda found the answer they were looking for from none other than the original Fallout titles, and surprisingly, the Burnout series. We felt we needed to do something new with role-playing and guns. The original inspiration was Imagine Burnout Crash Mode with body parts, and we talked about it and Emil came up with the name. VATS would become the staple system that Bethesda believed would separate themselves from not only the previous Fallout titles, but all the shooters on the market at the time, like Halo 3 and Call of Duty 4. As the VATS system let players do awesome kills without the need to be a pro Twitch gamer, as Emil explained to Gaming Nexus. Fundamentally, the inspiration for VATS came from the aim shot in Fallout 1 and 2, but for us, it just wasn't a matter of wanting to copy what the previous games did. We knew we were going to have lots of first and third person combat, and wanted to be just as much about character skill as it would be player skill. That's really what VATS accomplishes. It's all character skill, and doesn't require crazy Twitch skills. And for Todd Howard, this is something he especially liked. We wanted to try something that attaches you to your character, that lets you have your character on the screen do something you, the player, can't do, that your character can. You go in VATS, blow the leg off one guy, the head off another, and the arm off another, and unless you're like a Call of Duty ninja master, you could never do as a player. It's like we want you to feel super powerful in those moments, because your character in the world is super powerful. Creating something that would be so integral to the overall gameplay of Fallout 3 though was not easy, and had to be split into two distinct parts, the gameplay portion and the cinematics portion. The one thing everybody loved were the playbacks, you know, when people died in fabulous ways or it showed your character personally. So we had to separate VATS into two entities. One was the gameplay part of it, the numbers, what does my character do when he shoots your arm? And then there was the playback, which all went into art in terms of being a cinematic joy buzzer. The gameplay portion of VATS was rather simple though. Players go in, queue up their attacks, leave, and see them play out cinematically, making VATS feel like it was a natural element that was within the flow of combat. The AP needed for a shot was based on a weapon's rate of fire. Pistols could get more shots off than say a shotgun. The camera would then zoom in on the target, VATS would scan the target for the player's hit percentages. This accomplished two things for players. It looked really cool, and the second part was the scan was detecting how much of the body part players could see to get a good hit percentage. The more technical aspect of Bethesda's glorified real-time aim shot was the cinematic playback part. The system needed to capture numerous camera angles and various playback shots. Bethesda included a VATS camera section of the editor where they could set up almost anything they wanted, such as a special camera that tracks a bullet in slow motion that shoots a gun out of someone's hand, but only if they are using a specific pistol and only on a certain enemy. Pretty much anything they wanted to do, they could set it up quick. But one of the major complexities that Bethesda ran into was figuring out how to time everything together. Since VATS is moving in real time, it's not a replay. So each of the cameras controlled how fast all the things around the player were moving. Bethesda had to program the enemy camera to move at 1/10 the camera speed compared to the world around the player that was completely paused. Bethesda did attempt using everything at the same speed, but it just didn't give the same feel or look that they were looking for. The biggest issue with VATS was when players were getting attacked by another enemy though as they entered it, as Emil explained. Another thing we stumbled into, because time is moving forward, is that while you're watching an enemy react to getting shot in this great camera angle, your character can be getting mauled by another enemy. Really frustrating early on as we played it. So we do two things now. One, depending on the camera chosen, we essentially pause the rest of the world. And two, we have a setting that dramatically reduces the damage the player takes during such an occurrence. You probably wouldn't notice any of these things, the playback just looks right. But you'd be surprised how much tweaking goes into making a 2-second snippet work well. Bethesda did some promotional work for Fallout 3 in 2007, releasing 5 pieces of concept art by Greg Mullins on their Fallout 3 website. But the real promotional work came during the infamous E3 2007 in Santa Monica, where the convention center was held across multiple hotels with the main show being in a bunker. Todd Howard had one goal for this E3, make sure Tim Kaine saw the demo and make sure that he liked it. This wasn't going to be an easy task either, as Tim Kaine still felt like his baby had been adopted and been raised by a whole new family. But when it was time for Bethesda to take the stage, Tim Kaine was in attendance, and to their relief, Tim Kaine loved it. I just watched entranced. It was Fallout in first person, and it was mesmerizing. It was immersive. It was incredible. Even when I saw the VAT system, I'm like, that is what our called shot system would be like if it was converted into first person. Passing the Tim Kaine test and finishing E3 strong, winning the Best of the Show award, the team had 1.5 years left of polishing and getting the final systems in place before their October 2008 release date. One of the final pieces that needed polish for Fallout 3 was the music. Mark Lamptey, the audio director, was inspired by the score of the original Fallout, but Bethesda was looking to go in a new direction with the sound for Fallout 3. To do this, Lamptey brought on Enon Zur, who did the music for Prince of Persia: Warrior Within and Crysis. Enon was picked for his ability to work with ambient music with orchestral elements, giving Bethesda a different angle than what the other Fallout games had possessed. Bethesda was looking to portray a doomsday hopelessness feel mixed with the unusual twisted scientific elements within it. The overall direction they wanted Enon to go was to create a score that wouldn't be too depressing, but also add a slight heroic signature to it, to bring the feeling of all hope isn't lost. Some of it was inspired by the sci-fi music of Jerry Goldsmith, but I was really trying to take orchestral elements into no man's land, so to speak, and then combine it with some weird non-orchestral ones, so it has a futuristic approach, but in a retro kind of way. He created 3 different main ambiances that would be used for each biome of Fallout 3. The ruined cities, which were trying to describe the strange populated areas, the desert, and the water world style. That was clanking metals and other industrial sounds, giving Fallout 3 much more variance from the original games. All in all, the process took Enon and Lamptey just about 6 months to complete, with 40 total tracks completed, one of which Bethesda completely loved, the main theme. The theme set the entire tone of the game, with the main chords and melody being echoed throughout the entire playthrough. With the release quickly approaching, the team was still fighting over which blue to use for the vault suits, or what was the right hue of green for the Pip-Boy screen, and the rest of the game. Something that did take the team a long time to figure out as they went through every green possible. And if someone used the wrong shade, only Todd Howard ever noticed, right up until the game was going gold, which happened on October 9th, 2008. There was one big issue that Todd Howard believed could hinder sales of their vision of Fallout 3, the combat system. Howard figured that the combat could potentially make people believe the game was something it wasn't. I guess my only concern is that people won't really get it for what it is, that they might confuse it with something on either end of the spectrum, and then when they buy it, they're let down in some way that we didn't expect. But Todd and his team attempted to expect any way someone was going to play Fallout 3, from casual to original fans. Casual players will probably play Fallout 3 as a story-driven shooter, and you can do that. You don't need to pick locks or level up your science. That's why we don't always hammer home that the game is an RPG. We're just trying to make something that is worthy of the series, but also open it up to people who maybe would have liked the original games if they had been playing them 10 or 11 years ago. Fallout 3 released on October 28th to universal acclaim. It was praised for its open-ended gameplay and flexible character leveling system. Critics commended its immersive world filled with intricacies and attention to detail, which contributed to an incredible experience. The game's minimalistic sound design, coupled with a nostalgic music selection, further enhanced its immersive qualities. There were criticisms, though, regarding recycled plot elements from previous entries. Notably, Tim Kaine explaining how he would have not have used the Enclave or the Super Mutants at all, and would have created a whole new original story for the East Coast. But there were no bigger criticisms of Fallout 3 than the ending. Even Tim Kaine hated it. I hated the ending. There, I said it. I didn't like the sudden problem with the purifier, and I especially didn't like the lack of real meaningful multiple endings beyond what I chose in the final few minutes. But the worst thing about the ending was there was no mention of the fate of places I had visited. In my head, I had already imagined slides for Megaton, the Citadel, Rivet City, Underworld, GNR, the Enclave, or the mysterious Commonwealth, but I got pretty much nothing. Bethesda was fully behind the ending they came up with and really thought it was going to work. They believed that after the 30 to 60 hours of playthrough that the ending of the player's sacrifice would be a huge emotional journey. And when it released, that did not happen. The game came out, people played it, and got to the end. And a great majority of them were disappointed. They wanted to keep playing. They wanted to live in the world we had given them. So Bethesda did something they probably wouldn't have normally done. They changed the ending. So we did something completely unexpected, and we actually changed the fiction of the end of the game. We gave the player a stay of execution. So if you have the Broken Steel DLC or Game of the Year edition of Fallout 3, it actually changed the ending. You survive. It's 2 weeks later, and you get to continue living in the world. The moral of the story is that in a video game, in an interactive experience, that experience is more important than the static fiction you've created. But even with this change, players were still left wondering why they couldn't use a follower to sacrifice themselves for in the ending. And that came down to the fact that followers were implemented very late into the development, and the ending had already been decided. We'd only ever planned for you sending Sarah Lyons into the Purifier, because we knew from a story standpoint that she'd definitely be in there with you. But what we could do and what we did ultimately do is try to cover that stuff in dialogue. You can ask the followers to go into the Purifier and they'll tell you why they won't. We felt that fit with their personalities, but really, they didn't sell the player in a single line of dialogue. So in the end, the players were left with a why the hell can't they do it sort of feeling. And while it might not have been the true successor for Fallout purist, calling Fallout 3 Oblivion with guns, something that Gavin Carter foreshadowed, I feel like when people see it's first person, they're gonna say, oh, there's Oblivion, it's Oblivion with guns. It didn't really matter, as Bethesda did enough to see Fallout 3 cemented as one of the greatest games ever made, all because they took a risk and used their passion to just create an awesome game. We felt like we'd done everything we could at that point. We're obviously very pleased that the game has been received well by critics and fans. People really seem to be enjoying it, which is always the main thing. If you enjoyed this video, I recommend watching this one, as you'll most likely enjoy it as well.